But a hearth is it's kind of this sticky outy shelf that sits in front of the fire, right? I've got a brick hearth on mine. It's a little ledge, and so if you're warming up food or if you've just pulled something out of the oven, then there it sits on the hearth. The hearth is this the goods are coming out of the oven, and they got to cross the hearth. They got to come out of the fire and onto the table. I think it was when my twins were about to be born back in about 2010. I felt like I wanted to make bread. I can't really explain why that happened. So Jeannie, my wife, took me to Chapters, and we went to just a solid book on how to make bread. Surely there had to be some kind of authority on making bread in there, and I kind of felt like there had to be a right way of making bread. Everybody's got all their recipes, and there's 1,000 ways of doing it, but it seemed to me like there should be a right way of doing it. And if you followed those instructions, it was like the whole day you were just making bread. And I thought, people had their daily bread. Give us this day our daily bread. They had bread every day. They weren't doing that. Right? It just didn't. I knew that wasn't the case. So, because you just couldn't find it. We looked on the internet. We looked everywhere, and there was nobody with a simple process. In fact, it was the opposite. It seemed like everybody was boasting about how complicated their process was. And it can be like that, right? And they'll tell you, well, you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you don't capture this subtle element unless you do this. And I get that kind of stuff. I'm not writing it off, but we wanted something that you would love, that you could eat every single day without getting sick of it. So we didn't want a strong sourdough, because most people can't handle too much of that. Kids had to be able. If you can't get kids to eat it, no mother's going to buy it. It's just not going to be in the house, because it's always going to go bad. So it had to be something kids wanted to eat, and it had to be something that you could do, even as a baker supplying for other people, that it was realistic. It wouldn't consume your life. We're farmers, so it can't go consuming your life. And so it was the bread itself, the recipe, the everything about it has been designed around the reality of I guess farm life, just practical living, work to be done. You don't have time to fuss with things, and I think a lot of people, they think that unless you can spend the time to fuss with things, they're not going to be any good. But there's a certain simplicity in the bread itself that you have to be able to walk away from the bread, because you got to go, help some calves give birth or lambs or whatever. You got to be able to have the unpredictability of a farm insert itself into your baking life. And so there had to be big open windows for bake times. And it was a practical sort of country loaf that we were pursuing. It's rooted in an idea. It wasn't about pursuing flavor or luxury or anything like that at any cost. It wasn't at any cost. It was always the function had to be there. Not that you weren't willing to do things that paid off, but it had to be a realistic loaf of bread, and I believe that's what we have now. And then I found a book, and I think it was Jim Leahy. The book was mostly recipes, because the instructions on how to make it was so simple, so grounding. It's so real to put that wood in there and be responsible and get it in the oven, and you got to have the right amount of wood, and you're looking in the oven and you're seeing if the soot's burning off, and you find that sweet spot. And it's not all designed around thermometers and preheat schedules and all that. It's the real thing. I think that there's so much more to food and bread and life than just mechanics, biochemistry, these things we can see under a microscope or with an infrared camera. I just don't think that heat coming from one source is the same as heat coming from another. How are you going to notice it in the bread? I don't know. I guess it's more of a belief. It's more of a faith that it's a right and wholesome way of doing things. There's something whole about starting the process and finishing it all in a, it's the same way that people would have made bread 2,000 years ago. We get different batches of flour from different places and different harvests, and they absorb different amounts of water, and there are different times of year, and at different times of year the dough ferments at different temperatures, which means there's more yeast or more bacteria. You always wake up in the morning and you approach your dough and you're like, I wonder what it's going to be like today, because it's always different. And then if it's different, you respond. You're in a relationship with this constantly changing thing. We never really meant to be pretentious. In fact, it wasn't even really intended. We set up this business to help people with health problems, and so it was called, Harvest Haven Health. And so then when we opened up this new building and we had this bakery, it was like, well, what are we going to call it? And somebody suggested, well, why don't we call it the Harvest Haven Hearth? And so we thought, well, that's great. So that's what we did. And then I sat there and I noticed. I thought, well, isn't it funny that Hearth is the first three letters of heaven and the last three letters of earth. And that's been kind of our purpose, is that's our business. We are where heaven meets earth. And we're so disconnected now. We don't know. We don't receive from the land anymore because we've poisoned it and we've poisoned ourselves. But here, if you come out into the country to our home, our building, our store, our life, this is where heaven meets earth, and that's what the bread is coming out of. I know it can sound a little presumptuous, but it's just righteous bread. That's all there is to it.